Okay, so it should be working now. Last time we tried to do this, we ended up with no audio, and so I was trying to make sure there's at least a backup audio solution for this. So this is now the last lecture of the quantitative big imaging course before the exercises, before the project presentations next week. So the projects we'll talk about at the end of the lecture, and sort of the order or structure for who's presenting to just kind of confirm everyone's on the same page for that. But for today, our focus will really be on scaling up in big data. And this is trying to bring in all the things we've covered so far in the class and focus on how you handle lots and larger data sets using these approaches. So of course, there's lots of literature and useful references. A lot of the things you see here will be referenced very briefly in the lecture, particularly these top ones, which serve as more of the theoretical basis for a lot of what we're doing. And then sort of the specific things with ETH that we have info sort of on Condor. So if you're an ETET, how you can use the tools here. So take advantage of the computer labs to scale up your analysis, and then tools like SunGrid Engine, which is a similar tool to what's used on a lot of the larger clusters at ETH. And then a bit more on sort of databases and the theoretical background for that. And then finally, some cloud computing articles, although we won't get into that in too much detail. So in terms of kind of the outline, we'll start with the motivation, we always do. Then we'll have a bit of computer science principles. So for those of you who are unfamiliar with parallelism, distributed computing, imperative processing, imperative programming, declarative programming. So there's a course going on now, guys. There's a course, so use another computer lab or be quiet. And then organization, queue systems, cluster computing, parameterization, and databases. We'll then move to big data. So sort of what does MapReduce look like? What does Spark look like? Streaming, cloud computing, and then so how do you scale beyond these approaches? So when we look at sort of the motivation, there's kind of three different types of problems that we'll run into. One of them is really big data sets. And so this is where you have data sets themselves, which are quite large, where you need large amounts of memory to even process the data. And you often need to have multiple copies of the data to do what you're doing. So if you're doing things like filtering or segmentation, you need to have the original image and you need to have the filtered image in memory at the same time, which is then 2 copies of the image. So computers with more than 256 gigabytes of memory are expensive or difficult to find. There are getting better and better options for this. So if you look at Amazon today, you can get a machine with 4 terabytes of memory, which then makes some of these problems much easier to deal with. And even computers that have sort of 16 cores still have 16 gigabytes per CPU. And so if you're trying to process really large data sets in parallel, it becomes much more difficult if you're dealing with very large image sets. Drive speed and network file access can become quite a limiting factor. And so if you're dealing with sort of reading in a terabyte of image data, if you're reading that from a hard drive, that takes a very long time to read in, and you can try to read it in parallel, but fundamentally you're limited by how fast a single hard drive can read data in. You have the problem if sort of it crashes, you lose everything, or you have a situation where you have to write a bunch of manual, messy checkpoint code, which sort of says, if I get to this step, save the result, and if the saved result's present, then go to the next step. The next use case for this is sort of many data sets, and so this is where you have kind of genome scale studies or time series studies where you'll have thousands of time points or thousands of different images that you're trying to analyze in exactly the same way. And so this involves being able to handle a large amount of data analysis in a very similar parallel manner. And the dynamic experiments, animal phenotyping, And so there's some examples here where you're trying to do live animal imaging, where you get around 328 gigabytes for each frame, and you can have hundreds of frames if you're looking at sort of the growth of an animal. And if you look at something like radiology in hospitals, in Switzerland alone, there's around a petabyte of data that are created every year, and almost none of which are automatically analyzed. For sort of exploratory studies, this is the last part, where you're not really sure what you're looking for, and you want to be able to develop sort of new analyses and test hypotheses quickly, and you don't want to wait 48 hours to get results. And so you might not necessarily have 328 gigabytes of data, but you don't want to have to wait hours to see the results on your smaller data set. And so doing exploratory studies requires that you have some quick iteration cycles with your analysis. So in terms of kind of example projects, this is a project that we were working on with a group in the US from Pennsylvania, where they have zebrafish, sort of full animal images, and their resolution is sort of 0.74 micrometers, and they end up with sort of 20 to 40 billion voxels per sample. And so here it's important to kind of identify single cells, look at cellular networks and connectivity, classification of cell type to see which cell types grow at which time, and then ultimately like registration of these images with other histological images to see how the whole story sort of fits together. Is that? Oh, that image doesn't work. So if we, I think it's here. Fish scan through. Should work here. So it should work in the online slides. I'm not sure why it doesn't. But this is sort of a slice by slice view of that whole data set, obviously downsampled significantly to show it here, but that you see that there's quite, if you look at each one of these points, it represents a single cell, and so you want to be able to run these analyses in a large scale fashion and be able to keep track of all of these different objects. If you look at sort of the Human Brain Project or the Blue Brain Project, both sort of run out of EPFL and Institute in Geneva, if you're trying to look at sort of the whole brain with a cellular resolution, and so this is just an example with a rat brain, where you have sort of a cubic centimeter, which is how big the brain is, and a micron resolution, you end up with 100 billion voxels, 1,000 billion, a trillion voxels per sample. And registration of separate scans together, identification of sort of blood vessel structures and networks, and so how are they linked together, how are they evolving at different time points, and then ultimately registration with other modalities like fMRI and histology to see how do these sort of brains reflect the other information that's gathered, so you can start to understand how this brain might actually work, or at least some of the important connected parts. And so you have examples here of sort of projects where you're dealing with an enormous amount of data, and sort of running one analysis on one machine is never going to be able to analyze data like this, or it's going to take so long that you're never going to do it. And so kind of what's wrong with the usual approaches? Normally when problems are approached, they're kind of solved as a single task as quickly as possible. And that if you look, I think this is MATLAB code, yeah, but very similar to the Python code we've done before, where if you're trying to filter your image, make a threshold, label the components, count how many voxels, and then save it to a file, you might make something like this, to go through, count your number of objects, find the average size, and save all the results at the end. And now if you want to compare something like Gaussian to median, or look at 3D instead of 2D, or even run the same analysis on a whole folder of images, you have this problem that you've kind of written this one block of code, and you need to go back and rewrite, make a new block of code, a new script to do that for Gaussian instead of median, or rerun it, change it so that it handles 3D images correctly, then change the file name in each one, and then make sure you change the output file name correspondingly so that you get new input and output files for each one. But that basically what you see is that if you start with what we call sort of a bad approach, so sort of an overly simplified approach, it's very difficult to fix this. And so if you want to handle things in sort of a big data reproducible manner, then you want to be sort of doing it correctly from the very beginning. And that's sort of what we'll focus on here. And so rather than focusing on making one script that executes once and works fine, how can you make things that are more general and easier to kind of piece together into future analyses? And so this is where we'll kind of get into the computer science principles of sort of the ideas that are important. And so this is a bit of a struggle because, of course, there's entire courses, PhD theses, companies that focus just on one individual task on this list. And we'll try to cover all of them in a tiny part of a lecture. But I think it's important to have at least an awareness for these kinds of ideas and how you can employ them correctly and sort of the take-home messages for this. So out of curiosity, has anyone done parallel programming before? And race contention, or sort of, what is it, race conditions, resource contentions, deadlocks? Yeah. Semaphores? Okay. So we have quite a few people who can benefit from this. So we're not going to get into all that detail. It's important just that you're aware of how difficult these things are and how many mistakes can be made. And sort of parallelism is kind of as easy as it sounds. And this is where you sort of divide a task into separate pieces, which can be worked on at the same time. And, so for example, if you walk on the phone and talk on the phone, or walk for 5 minutes and then talk on the phone for 5 minutes, you could perform first I walk and then I talk on the phone. Or you could put up, and that would take 10 minutes, or you could do both at the same time and take 5 minutes. And so because humans are very parallel beings to a limit, you can perform quite a few tasks at the same time. You can rehearse a speech while you're walking to work. You can take public transport and work at the same time. There's a lot of things you can do in parallel. Obviously, you only have 2 arms and 2 legs, and so anything that requires more than that doesn't work particularly well. But that you have the ability to do these tasks in parallel. And so rather than focusing on really code, I think real life examples are very good indicators of difficulty and help you understand the issues a little bit better. So distributed computing is kind of the same idea as parallel, but taking it one further. And so parallel is really focusing on sort of one computer or one processing unit. And what distributed is what happens when this is now not on the same computer anymore. And so what this means is that you're now dealing with different machines. You're dealing with machines that may have unreliable communication between them. And so, to go from parallel to distributed in the real world, a parallel task is you walking and talking on the phone at the same time. And distributed would be you dealing with, a team or your boss to try to solve a problem where your team members don't think in exactly the same way you do. They have different backgrounds. They may or may not understand the task the same way you do. They may not understand you perfectly well. And so you have a lot more issues that tend to come up that aren't an issue when you're just dealing with yourself. So when you look at sort of distributed computing examples, if you want, if you have 10 friends who collectively know all the capitals of the world, If you want to find the capital of a single country, you can just yell that country name and wait for someone to respond. And so that gives you sort of a very parallel distributed access to information where you don't have to go through one person one at a time to get the answer. You can just have everyone yell and you get the answer. To find out who knows the most countries, each you can yell how many countries they know, and then you select the highest one. If you take sort of a slightly more complicated problem, and you want to find sort of each friend has money in their pocket, and you want to find out how much total money is available, you can tell each person how much money they have, and you add it together. And so you kind of go through each person in the list and add whatever amount of money that they have together, and you sort of get the final result. For this, can anyone think of a more efficient way to do that task? So if you have 1,000 friends in a room and you want to figure out how much money you have in total, yeah?
Each person counts.
So each person counts? Yeah.
And the result is
yeah, but then you have to go through each person one at a time, right? And so how could you so if you have 10 people, that's probably fairly quick. But if you have 1,000 and then you have to go from Joe to Bob to Tim it can take quite long. Yeah?
We can get them each to count the rest, and then
You get what?
in half, and one person counts half, another person counts half.
Yeah? So that would be twice as fast?
But then cut it in half again.
Yeah. So it's easier to think about it the other way, where you say each person in the room finds a friend, tells their friend how much money they have, and then they sit down. And then each of the remaining people find a friend, tell them how much money they have, and then sit down. And so then this gets you into sort of the log n scale, where you're able to sort of give everyone the same instructions. And as long as you have a clear way of knowing who's said how much money they have and who hasn't, then you can efficiently get through this. This is something that you cover in sort of data structures or algorithms in computer science, but I think it's more useful to think about it for an actual real life problem. And then, if you have a slightly more complicated problem, and this one's a bit invented, but if you want to find the median coin value, the basic way would be you have everyone write down all the coins they have in their pocket, or bills, or whatever it might be, and then you put them all on one list. You then sort the list, and then go to the middle to find the median. And if you want to do this faster, how would you do it? And this isn't a super trivial question. I think this is actually a Google interview question. So if you have 1,000 machines and each machine has 1 million numbers on it, how do you find the median of all the numbers? Because the mean or the sum is quite easy. You can get the mean the same way, but median and mean aren't the same thing. Yeah?
You could have the machines or the students sort themselves.
Yeah. So they could sort themselves. But if you have 1 through 100 and I have 1 million through 10 million, then we still have to somehow bring them together in order to find out what the median is. And it's possible that you have 1 coin and I have 1,000 coins and someone else has 2 coins. And so that you could sort them themselves and it'd probably make it quicker when you do the sort globally. But you still have the problem that everyone might have different amounts and people could have vastly different distributions of coins in them. No ideas? Well, you think about it, and we can come back to it later if you're interested. And so one of the issues that you come up with here very quickly is this sort of idea of resource contention. And so that, for example, with the sorting of the list or counting all of the coins, that, if you have one person who has to go to each other person and ask them, how many coins do you have? I've got the total so far. I've already talked to these people, and I'm going to take your number and add it to the total. That there's resource contention. So there's potentially multiple people trying to talk to the same person at the same time. And as humans, we're very good generally at taking turns, not having everyone yell at the same time. I think if you go to Parliament or US Congress, that might not be the case. But in general, you're able to handle multiple people yelling at you and saying you first and then you to get the information sorted out. But computers are in general very bad at this. So if you try to write the same byte of memory at the same time, the computer generally will allow you to do this if you're allowed to write it, but it won't necessarily do it in the way you expect to do it, or it might kind of do it in a random way. And so if if one process is trying to add 1 to this number and another process is trying to add 5, one process by adding 1 might read the number and say, okay, I add 1, now it's supposed to be 6, and I put 6 back. The other process in the meantime might have read the number as 5, said I add 5, and I put 10 back, and so the number goes from 5 to 10 to 6, when it should in fact be 11. And so you have competing things trying to get to the same resources at the same time. And this particularly comes in with bit files as well. So for those of you who have used sort of Windows machines or computers from the 90s, you often ran into problems that this file is opened by another process and you can't write it or change it because that other process is allowed to write it and change it, and you can't have two things allowed to write it at the same time. Similarly with network resources, that if you have a limited amount of bandwidth and you have 30 computers trying to use it at the same time, you can end up with problems. And this is what we ended up with very quickly at the Paul Scher Institute, that if you have 30 machines and each machine has 24 cores and all of them are trying to download things from Amazon at the same time, you'll completely overwhelm the internet capacity of PSI because they just have one pipe connecting them to the outside world. And when you have 24 times 30 machines doing this, it's a huge amount of traffic. And so you need ways of saying that only 10 computers can talk at the same time. Otherwise, it'll become very slow because there's so many different things trying to happen. One of the things you come into as well is this idea of deadlock. So has everyone heard of the dining philosopher's problem? One person. And so the idea here is that you have 6 philosophers at a table, and you have 6 forks, and everyone needs, for whatever reason, 2 forks to eat. And so every philosopher takes the fork on their left, and then they're supposed to take the fork on their right, and then they're supposed to start eating. And so, again, with people, this probably wouldn't happen. But with computers, when everyone takes the fork on the left, there's now no forks available. And so they all wait for the fork on the right to become available. And they'll end up waiting forever because everyone's waiting for one of the forks to come out. And no one ever starts or finishes eating. And so this is sort of the issue of deadlock, where if processes are instructed to do exactly the same thing at exactly the same time, and there are limited resources, you'll end up in a situation where the resources do not suffice, and nothing happens at all because they're all waiting for something to come available, and the one that's using it can't give that up until it gets more of what it was looking for. And so it's a contrived problem, but it occurs in alarming amount in computer science. Particularly now that you have, even your cell phone probably has 8 cores inside it, and so it's capable of doing 8 or more things at the same time. And so you'll end up with very, very fast processors trying to access the same things at the same time and running into issues with this. And so sort of the parallel challenges that you have to deal with are this idea of coordination. And so, you have to coordinate between tasks, which core or which thread is supposed to be doing which task at which time. And how do you take something like, a fast Fourier transform and break it up into little pieces so that each core can do a small little piece and it can work independently from the other cores. The second issue is mutability. And so if you have two cores trying to write the same information at the same time, you end up with this sort of non-deterministic behavior, where if one, tries to add 5 and the other one tries to add 1, you'll end up adding 5 or 1. And that's not really the kind of behavior you want to see if you want to have reproducible work. And then, the simple act of blocking, of basically saying everything has to wait its turn before it writes to the disk or before it edits the memory, does work, but you end up with the problem that, you can end up waiting so long for something to finish that it's just as slow as doing it serially. And so you have no benefits of doing parallel computing at all. Distributed challenges are kind of all of the things you have with parallel, but made even more complicated because you have to send instructions and data to other computers. And so you have to be able to communicate with them well. You have to send instructions in a way that the other computer understands. And so if you're dealing with a computer here that's a Mac running Python 3.6, and your other computer is a Windows machine running Python 2.7, and you send an instruction, it's very unlikely that that computer will understand the instruction that you sent because you have different versions of Python and different libraries, and you can have lots of problems with that. Fault tolerance becomes much more important because if you have one computer, and that computer can crash, but if that computer crashes, your job's done anyways. If you have 1,000 computers working on a single problem and one fails, you don't want the entire rest of the computers to crash because one computer failed. And I think at Google, at least as of 5 years ago, had a hard drive fail every minute. So they have so many computers in use all the time, and I'm sure Facebook and all the other companies are at this level as well, and I do, but that they had a hard drive crashing every minute. And so obviously if you're dealing with that scale of machinery and that scale of failure, you need approaches that are able to handle one computer crashing and the rest of the computers realizing that that computer has crashed and then taking over the workload automatically. And so that's what's called sort of fault tolerance or resilience. And then data storage. And it's sort of how can you process and access data from many different computers quickly without lots of expensive infrastructure. And so, if you look at the clusters at Paul Scher Institute and ETH, they have, I think, InfiniBand connecting them to really high performance disks so that you can read from a number of machines in parallel. And this works very well. But again, if you're trying to read from 30 machines and you have 24 processes on each one of these machines, then you completely saturate what InfiniBand is capable of delivering. And so you'll end up very quickly with a data storage problem that you're trying to read too many things at the same time, and you end up with really slow access, and anyone else trying to read from that data storage will run into problems. And so now this moves away from sort of that whole parallel and distributed aspect into more of how it's actually implemented. Were there any questions on the parallel distributed parts? I mean, for any of you who've been in management roles, you can appreciate that, getting a group of 5 people to work 5 times faster than just one person by themselves is incredibly difficult. It's not a very easy task to solve. That you have to come up with, which task is each person good at? How can you make sure that people aren't doing exactly the same thing? How can you make sure that things are divided evenly? And, you don't want 2 people to be sitting waiting because there's nothing left to do while 3 other people are completely overwhelmed. And so all of those issues come up quite frequently in and outside of computer science. And there's not a general solution for everything. There's not one way that magically solves all of your problems. They typically require a lot of thinking and a lot of sort of careful planning in order to get that to happen. And it's one of the things that you often see when PhD students have a lot of data that they need to process. They see that there's this nice multi-processing toolbox in Python, or there's this multi-threading tools in Scala or Java, and then they just start writing parallel code without appreciating how difficult it is to write parallel code well and how many problems you have to solve. And so this is just trying to make you aware that, just because there are libraries which let you have multiple threads or let you start multiple processes doesn't mean it's easy to do parallel computing. That there's a lot of major issues you run into very quickly when you try to do those tasks. So what this talks about now is more sort of the programming style. And so there's kind of two styles we'll talk about here. The first one is sort of imperative programming. And this is where you kind of directly coordinate tasks on a computer. And so if you look at C, C++, Java, MATLAB, most of the Python that we've done, you have sort of exact orders that are given. And so there's kind of an implicit time ordering. If we even look at that example we showed earlier, you have imread, BW label, save, or histogram, save, those 5 tasks, and they have to happen in exactly that order, and they're sort of all dependent on one another. And so, exact orders are given, data management is manually controlled, job and task scheduling is manual. There's potential to tweak and optimize performance within the individual tasks, but there's not any potential to sort of parallelize or fundamentally run the whole task much more efficiently. And so if we take this kind of simple example that we had, I think, in the very first lecture about making a soup, this is the imperative way of describing that process, that you have 7 steps, and it's buy vegetables at the market, then buy meat at the butcher's, then chop carrots into pieces, then. And so for an intelligent person, you're able to see that task 2 doesn't depend at task 1 at all. But when you write it in this way, there's no way for a robot or a computer doing this task to know that task 2 is completely independent of task 1. And so when you do things in this imperative way, it has no way of knowing that. So it doesn't know that it can actually send someone else to go pick up the meat, because picking up the meat has nothing to do with the vegetables, but step 3 does have something to do with step 1. And so if you put your tasks in this imperative form with sort of just a list of operations, there's no way for it to know which things are connected and which things should be done in which order. And this is how most computer languages work and how most people are taught to program. And so if we look at sort of declarative programming, this is the alternative you have. And this is with SQL, Erlang, Haskell, Scala. Python and R can be declarative. They aren't always. And this is where your goals are stated rather than the specific details. And so data is automatically managed and copied. Scheduling is automatic, but not always efficient. So when you're doing imperative, if you look at sort of the first computers that came out, they were all imperatively done, and each line of code was hand optimized so that it would run as efficiently as possible in exactly the most sort of performant order. And now you have compilers that do this automatically for you. But if you're trying to do sort of one very, very specific task, like, for example, a Fourier transform, you can benefit from the fact that Intel and MKL and LibBLAS have been optimized for decades to make a Fourier transform happen very, very, very quickly. And so it's unlikely that you rewriting the Fourier transform in a declarative way would be a massive improvement on the sort of analysis that's done. And so if you look at sort of making a soup with this metaphor, that you can have sort of buy vegetables at the market, this goes into shop veggies. Buy meat at the butcher, this goes into shop meat, and then you can say wait for shop veggies, and then chop carrots into pieces, wait for shop veggies, chop potatoes, and that you have kind of a list here of independent tasks. And the relationship between the different tasks is specified in the task itself. And so this task knows you can start doing it, but if you haven't already shopped for the veggies, then it doesn't make sense to actually run the task. And so you need to wait for the shop veggies to be finished before you can start. And the same thing with meat at the butcher, where, you can't, does that show up down here? Or maybe it doesn't show up anywhere. But basically you can parallelize this task by just running all of these independently. And this one won't do anything until this one's already finished. And so you end up with the situation where the sort of relationships or dependencies are set up within them. So I guess we'll take a break here. Are there any questions on that imperative and declarative? It's a little bit vague, but we'll have more examples of this and concrete examples with actual programs that should make it a bit clearer. Okay, so we'll have a short break.